Welcome to Velnora Sleep, where peaceful nights meet effortless comfort. Experience the art of deep relaxation with our premium sleep essentials, designed to calm your mind and elevate your rest. The dream that floated before Titanic ever touched the water. Hey guys, tonight we're going to drift back to the early years of the 20th century. A time when the world was changing so quickly that people genuinely believed almost anything was possible. Electricity was replacing candlelight. Automobiles were slowly convincing horses that retirement might be approaching. Aeroplanes had just begun leaving the ground for more than a few nervous seconds, and enormous ocean liners were becoming floating cities. So, dim the lights if you can. Settle into your favorite chair, or better yet, let your pillow do most of the work. There's nowhere to rush tonight. We're simply going to follow the story of a ship that became one of the most famous vessels ever built. Not because it completed hundreds of successful voyages, but because it only needed one to become part of history forever. The Titanic is remembered as a tragedy. Everyone knows that much. But before it became a disaster, it was something else entirely. It was a dream, a monument to confidence, a giant floating promise that technology had finally mastered nature. As history enjoys reminding us every so often, confidence and reality do not always travel on the same ticket. So let's begin long before the iceberg, long before the lifeboats, long before that chilly April night in 1912. Let's begin with an idea. The early 1900s were wonderfully optimistic. Factories filled entire cities. Steel production reached levels that would have amazed previous generations. Railways stretched across continents. Telegraph cables crossed oceans. Newspapers carried stories from thousands of miles away almost overnight. People truly believed progress had no ceiling. Every year seemed to introduce another invention that would make life easier, faster, or bigger. And if something could be made bigger, well, someone almost certainly tried. Ocean travel had become one enormous competition. Crossing the Atlantic wasn't exactly a pleasant holiday. Even first-class passengers spent several days surrounded by endless water, unpredictable weather, and the occasional reminder that the ocean was perfectly capable of ignoring human schedules. Still, millions traveled. Some were wealthy tourists. Some were businessmen. Many were immigrants searching for entirely new lives. Every ticket represented hope. Shipping companies understood this very well. Two companies stood above nearly everyone else. One was Cunard, the other was White Star Line. Their rivalry wasn't especially dramatic in the sword-fighting sense. It involved rather more accountants than pirates. But it was fierce. Every new ship needed to be larger, faster, more luxurious, more comfortable, more impressive. Because if your rival launched a magnificent vessel, well, you simply couldn't respond with something merely adequate. That would never do. The Cunard Line had recently introduced two spectacular ships, Lusitania and Mauretania. They were astonishingly fast. Crossing the Atlantic became something close to a sporting event. Newspapers celebrated speed records almost like Olympic victories. White Star Line looked at this situation and made an interesting decision. Instead of chasing speed, why not chase luxury? If someone else wanted to win races, White Star would build floating palaces, ships where passengers might almost forget they were surrounded by thousands of meters of cold Atlantic water. It was a bold strategy, comfort instead of raw speed, elegance instead of racing. And that decision would eventually lead to three remarkable ships: Olympic, Titanic, Britannic, known together as The Olympic-class liners. Even their names sounded ambitious. Not ordinary ships, legendary ones. Before a single piece of steel had been assembled, these vessels already carried enormous expectations. Design work began. Engineers drafted plans that seemed almost unbelievable. The ships would stretch nearly 900 feet. At the time, that was difficult for many people to even picture. Newspapers tried comparing the length to city blocks, cathedrals, railway stations, anything familiar enough for readers to imagine. Photographs rarely captured the scale. People standing beside the hull looked like tiny insects. Even experienced shipbuilders reportedly paused just to stare. Sometimes, humans build something so enormous that our brains require a few moments to accept it. Titanic had that effect. Construction took place in Belfast, Northern Ireland, at the Harland and Wolff shipyard. Thousands of workers arrived every morning. Steel plates, massive cranes, rivets glowing red hot. Hammering echoed through the yards from sunrise until evening. The sound became almost constant. Imagine living nearby. You probably didn't need an alarm clock. The shipyard itself resembled a city. Workers specialized in different trades. Riveters, steelworkers, carpenters, electricians, plumbers, painters, engine fitters. Each person handled only a tiny portion of the project. Few could step back and fully appreciate the entire ship. It's a curious thing about massive achievements. Most are completed by thousands of ordinary people doing ordinary jobs extraordinarily well. No single worker built Titanic. Together, they all did. The giant gantries towered above Belfast. Visitors came simply to watch construction. People enjoy watching enormous things being assembled. Apparently, this has always been true. Today, we'd probably record everything on our phones. Back then, people simply stood there looking upward. The steel skeleton slowly climbed higher, piece by piece, week after week, month after month. It must have felt almost alive, growing steadily against the skyline. Harland and Wolff spared little expense. Titanic contained advanced engineering for its day. 16 watertight compartments, huge steam engines, electric lighting, modern heating, powerful pumps, luxury cabins, elegant dining rooms, reading lounges, smoking rooms, a Turkish bath, a swimming pool. Yes, a swimming pool, which feels slightly ironic in hindsight. But remember, nobody involved expected irony to become part of the story. The watertight compartments became particularly famous. If one compartment flooded, doors could close, water would remain trapped, the ship could continue sailing. It was genuinely impressive engineering. Unfortunately, nature doesn't always cooperate with engineering diagrams. There's another detail worth mentioning. People often repeat that Titanic was officially advertised as unsinkable. Reality is a little more complicated. Some newspapers used language suggesting the ship was practically unsinkable. Some commentators praised its safety with extraordinary confidence. Engineers themselves tended to speak more carefully. But confidence has an interesting habit. Once enough people repeat something, it becomes accepted as fact. Eventually, many passengers boarded believing the ship represented the safest vessel ever constructed, which, in fairness, it probably was, at least according to contemporary standards. History judges with information unavailable at the time. That's important to remember. The people building Titanic weren't careless fools. They were among the finest shipbuilders in the world. They genuinely believed they were creating something exceptional. And in many ways, they absolutely were. Launching day finally arrived. May 1911. Thousands gathered. Launching a ship isn't quite like launching a modern rocket. There's less countdown, more gravity. Literally. The enormous hull rested on specially prepared slipways. Supports were released, slowly at first, then faster. The giant vessel slid toward the River Lagan. Greased timber helped guide the movement. Imagine watching 46,000 tons begin moving. Not quickly, but irresistibly. Momentum is a fascinating thing. Once something that enormous starts moving, everyone simply hopes every calculation was correct. Fortunately, they were. Titanic entered the water successfully. Cheers echoed across Belfast. Workers celebrated, families smiled, newspapers praised the achievement. Yet, curiously, the ship wasn't finished. Far from it. Launching only placed the hull into the water. Months of work remained. Engines required installation, furniture arrived, decorations, carpets, wood paneling, crystal light fixtures, thousands upon thousands of individual details. Luxury doesn't assemble itself, especially Edwardian luxury. First-class accommodation became astonishingly elegant. Rich wood, beautiful staircases, fine furniture, large suites, private promenades, restaurants serving elaborate meals. Some cabins looked more like expensive hotels than shipboard rooms. Passengers paying the highest fares expected comfort equal to Europe's finest establishments. White Star intended to exceed those expectations. Second class also received impressive accommodation. In fact, many second-class cabins exceeded the standard of first class on older ships. That says quite a lot about changing expectations. Third class, often remembered only because of the tragedy, actually represented a significant improvement compared to earlier immigrant ships. Families enjoyed private cabins, better sanitation, decent meals, more space. Conditions remained modest, but far more humane than previous generations often experienced. For many immigrants, simply boarding Titanic already felt like entering a brighter future. They weren't chasing luxury, they were chasing opportunity. America waited on the other side of the Atlantic. Jobs, land, family, possibility. Entire lives packed into a few suitcases. Hope weighs almost nothing, yet somehow fills every available space. By early 1912, the finishing touches continued. Workers polished brass railings until they reflected sunlight. Stewards learned procedures. Crew members received assignments. Supplies arrived daily. Fresh food, coal, linens, china, mail bags, everything necessary for a transatlantic crossing. Coal alone required incredible effort. Hundreds of firemen and trimmers worked below decks, shoveling coal into roaring furnaces hour after hour. Passengers strolling elegant promenades rarely thought much about the exhausting labor happening several decks beneath their feet. Luxury often depends upon invisible work. That remains true today. Eventually, sea trials approached. Titanic needed testing. Would engines perform correctly? Would steering respond smoothly? Would equipment function properly? On April 2, 1912, the ship left Belfast for trials. Everything proceeded well. Inspectors approved the vessel. White Star accepted delivery. Titanic officially entered service. There was excitement everywhere. Newspapers followed every development. Bookings filled rapidly. Crew prepared uniforms. Passengers packed trunks. Letters were written home describing upcoming adventures. Some people saved for years to afford passage. Others barely noticed the cost. Titanic welcomed both extremes. One ship, many different worlds. No one boarding imagined they were stepping into one of history's most famous stories. To them, it was simply a voyage. Perhaps even the voyage. A grand beginning. An unforgettable experience. Though not quite for the reasons anyone expected. And that's where we'll gently pause for now. Because next, we'll leave the shipyard behind and make our way to Southampton, where the passengers, crew, dreams, ambitions, and ordinary routines all begin to gather beneath one towering ship. No one knows the ending yet. At least, not from where they're standing. And for one brief, quiet moment in April 1912, the future still looks wonderfully calm. Morning arrived quietly over Southampton. There was no sense that history was waiting at the docks. No dramatic music, no mysterious clouds gathering overhead, just another busy harbor waking up to another working day. Steam drifted lazily above the waterfront. Dock workers shouted instructions across the quays. Horses pulled heavy wagons stacked with luggage. Coal dust floated through the air, settling on boots, coats, and just about everything else within reach. It was, in many ways, an entirely ordinary morning. History often has that habit. The moments that later become famous rarely announce themselves in advance. Titanic now rested at the White Star Line berth. Even tied securely alongside the dock, she dominated the harbor. People stopped walking simply to look. Photographs from the time never quite capture the scale. Imagine standing at street level beside a modern apartment block that had somehow decided to float. That was roughly the impression many visitors described. Her 4 towering funnels stretched into the spring sky. 3 carried smoke. The 4th, despite popular belief, was not purely decorative. It mainly helped with ventilation and balanced the ship's elegant profile. Engineers appreciated the airflow. Designers appreciated the symmetry. Everyone seemed happy. Titanic had become exactly what White Star hoped. She looked powerful without appearing aggressive, elegant without looking fragile, massive without appearing clumsy. Not an easy combination. Meanwhile, hundreds of workers hurried aboard. Fresh vegetables arrived in wooden crates. Thousands of eggs, hundreds of kilograms of butter. Fresh bread, tea, coffee, wine, cheese, beef, lamb, fish packed carefully in ice. Enough food to feed more than 2,000 people for several days. Running a great ocean liner was rather like operating a small town. Only this town floated and occasionally crossed an ocean. The kitchens alone were astonishing. There were separate galleys for different passenger classes. Professional chefs organized supplies with military precision. Everything had its place. Meals mattered, especially to first-class passengers. Many expected the finest dining available anywhere in the world. White Star had no intention of disappointing them. Far below those elegant dining rooms, Another workforce prepared for a very different experience. The engineering crew, firemen, trimmers, greasers, engine fitters. These men would spend most of the voyage surrounded by heat, noise, and coal dust. While passengers admired sunsets from polished decks, someone else had to keep the engines alive. Every shovel of coal represented movement. Every furnace demanded constant attention. The work never really stopped. It simply changed shifts. The ship also welcomed its officers. Captain Edward John Smith was already something of a celebrity. He had spent decades at sea. His white beard and calm appearance inspired confidence almost immediately. Passengers often chose White Star voyages specifically because Captain Smith commanded them. That is a remarkable compliment for any captain. Imagine booking an airline today because you recognize the pilot's name. Captain Smith carried himself with quiet professionalism. He was respected by crew members and admired by passengers. This voyage was widely expected to be his final command before retirement. One last crossing. One magnificent ship. Then a peaceful retirement. History, unfortunately, had drafted a different plan. His second-in-command was Chief Officer Henry Wilde. Alongside him served First Officer William Murdoch and Second Officer Charles Lightoller. Each brought years of experience. They knew the Atlantic well. They understood weather, navigation, and discipline. Ocean travel depended upon routines. Every watch changed with careful precision. Every order followed established procedure. Ships survived through consistency, not improvisation. Elsewhere on board, stewards prepared cabins. Beds were made perfectly, fresh towels folded neatly, mirrors polished until almost invisible. Flowers arranged carefully throughout public rooms. Luxury often hides in tiny details. A passenger might never consciously notice them, but together they created an atmosphere, one of effortless comfort. At least that was the goal. Outside the ship, families gathered to say goodbye. Some embraced relatives for what they assumed would be only a few weeks. Others expected never to meet again. For immigrants traveling in third class, America represented a permanent move. Parents promised to write. Children waved excitedly. Friends joked nervously about seasickness. Everyone tried to sound optimistic, even when leaving home forever. There is something deeply human about harbors. They are places where excitement and sadness occupy exactly the same space. One person begins an adventure. Another begins missing them. Titanic welcomed passengers from many countries: Britain, Ireland, Sweden, Norway, Finland, France, Lebanon, Armenia, the United States, and many more. Different languages echoed through the corridors. Different dreams traveled together beneath one roof of steel. Some passengers carried leather trunks filled with fashionable clothes. Others carried little more than a single suitcase. Yet once aboard, every journey began the same way, with a ticket and hope. Among the wealthy passengers were some of the best-known names of the era: industrialists, business owners, writers, socialites. People accustomed to newspapers mentioning them by name. For them, Titanic represented comfort, status, a pleasant Atlantic crossing, nothing more. Perhaps they admired the grand staircase. Perhaps they planned elaborate dinners. Perhaps they looked forward to arriving in New York refreshed rather than exhausted. Perfectly reasonable expectations, after all. That was exactly what the ship had been built to provide. In second class, life looked rather different. School teachers, ministers, merchants, professionals, traveling for work or family. The accommodation impressed many visitors. Clean cabins, comfortable lounges, good food, not extravagant, simply pleasant. Third class held the largest number of dreams. Young couples heading toward new jobs. Large families hoping to reunite with relatives already living in America. Teenagers seeing the ocean for the first time. Small children who treated every corridor as an exciting maze. For them, Titanic wasn't famous. She was simply transportation, a very large one. One little boy reportedly became fascinated by the endless staircases. Children, fortunately, require very little to entertain themselves. A staircase can become an entire adventure. Adults usually overcomplicate things. By late morning on April 10, 1912, departure drew near. The great mooring ropes were prepared. Dock workers moved into position. Passengers crowded the rails. Friends gathered below. Bands played cheerful music. Handkerchiefs waved through the cool spring air. Steam whistles echoed across Southampton water. The engines slowly came alive, not with explosive drama, more like a giant creature stretching after a long sleep, almost gently. Titanic began moving, very slowly at first, so slowly that some passengers hardly noticed. Then the dock gradually slipped away. The voyage had officially begun. Almost immediately, something unexpected happened. As Titanic passed another ship, the New York, the enormous displacement of water created by the liner's movement pulled the smaller vessel toward her. The mooring lines holding New York snapped. Suddenly, the two ships drifted dangerously close together. Passengers leaned over the railings. Crew members reacted quickly. Tugboats rushed into action. Engines reversed. For a few tense minutes, everyone watched carefully. Fortunately, disaster was avoided. The gap between the ships remained just large enough. Today, many people remember this as an ominous sign. At the time, most simply viewed it as an unfortunate inconvenience. Large ships affected surrounding water in powerful ways. Experienced sailors understood this. The delay lasted about an hour. Then the journey resumed. Sometimes, history becomes tempting to rewrite in our minds. We search for warnings, clues, signs that someone should have recognized. But real life rarely works that way. Most events only become meaningful after we already know the ending. As Southampton disappeared into the distance, passengers settled into routine surprisingly quickly. Deck chairs appeared. Books were opened, letters were written, children explored. Stewards answered endless questions about meal times and cabin numbers. The Atlantic crossing had begun exactly as thousands of others had. Quietly, comfortably, orderly. No one felt they had boarded a legend. Only a ship, an exceptionally beautiful ship. The English coast slowly faded behind them. Ahead waited the first scheduled stop. Cherbourg, France. More passengers would board there, including some of the wealthiest travelers on the voyage. Then another stop in Queenstown, Ireland, today known as Cobh, the final port before the open Atlantic. After that, nothing but ocean for days, an endless blue road stretching toward New York. From the promenade deck, the sea looked peaceful. Gentle waves sparkled beneath the afternoon sun. Fresh air drifted across polished railings. Some passengers probably wondered how anyone could ever become bored at sea. Others had already claimed comfortable chairs. Just the steady rhythm of engines somewhere beneath your feet. Perhaps that is why ocean voyages fascinated so many people. For a little while, ordinary life remained on shore. Only the sea remained, and for the moment, the sea seemed perfectly content to welcome its newest visitor. As Titanic eased away from the English coast, the pace of life on board settled into something remarkably ordinary. That may sound surprising now. When we think of Titanic, we often imagine constant tension, as though everyone aboard somehow sensed what history had planned. But they didn't. For the passengers, this was simply the first day of a transatlantic voyage. The ship moved steadily through calm spring waters, leaving a broad white wake behind her. Seagulls followed for a while, as they often do, circling overhead in hopes that someone might be careless with a sandwich. Even birds, it seems, appreciate free lunch. The first stop came at Cherbourg, on the northern coast of France. Unlike Southampton, Cherbourg did not have a dock large enough for a ship the size of Titanic. Instead, smaller tender vessels ferried passengers, luggage, and mail out to the great liner waiting offshore. From the deck, the scene looked almost theatrical. Boats buzzed back and forth. Trunks were lifted aboard by cranes. Passengers leaned over the rails, watching new arrivals make their way toward the ship that everyone had been talking about for months. Among those boarding were some of the wealthiest travelers in the world. Businessmen, industrialists, families with servants, people accustomed to grand hotels and first-class railway carriages. For them, Titanic was not merely transportation. It was an experience. The first-class entrance resembled that of an elegant hotel more than a ship. Stewards greeted guests politely. Porters carried luggage with impressive efficiency. Cabins were shown, questions answered, tea was served. Within an hour, many passengers already behaved as though they had been living aboard for days. Humans adapt remarkably quickly to comfort. The voyage resumed before evening. The French coastline slowly disappeared behind the horizon, replaced once again by open water. The following morning brought another stop, Queenstown, known today as Cobh, in Ireland. This was the final port before the Atlantic. For many third-class passengers, boarding here marked the beginning of the greatest journey of their lives. Some had traveled for days just to reach the harbor. Others had never before seen a vessel anywhere near this size. Imagine standing on the dock and looking up at a ship taller than many buildings in your town. It must have seemed almost impossible that something so enormous could move at all. Families stepped aboard carrying modest belongings. Some held worn suitcases. Others carried carefully wrapped parcels containing nearly everything they owned. Children looked around with wide eyes. Parents tried to appear calm, even if their own excitement was difficult to hide. Many believed they were sailing toward a future filled with opportunity. Factories, farms, new homes, relatives waiting in America. Letters received months earlier had painted hopeful pictures. Whether those hopes would become reality was another matter. but hope itself is often enough to begin a journey. Shortly after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Titanic departed Queenstown. Now there would be no more ports, no more passengers, only the Atlantic Ocean stretching nearly 3,000 miles ahead. The coastline of Ireland gradually faded into the distance. Some passengers remained on deck, watching until land became little more than a faint gray line. Others quietly returned inside. A few may have realized they were seeing their homeland for the last time. It was an emotional moment for many, though not one filled with tears alone. There was excitement as well, a sense of possibility. History often remembers disasters. The people living through those moments usually remember their dreams. Life aboard soon developed its own gentle rhythm. Breakfast, morning walks, reading, conversations, lunch, afternoon tea, dinner, music in the lounges, then sleep. And the cycle began again. The days were structured without feeling rushed. Passengers had time, something many modern travelers would probably find quite unfamiliar. No one hurried to catch a connecting flight. There were no departure gates, flashing warnings, no security announcements every few minutes. Just a ship, the sea, and several peaceful days to enjoy both. Captain Smith maintained a steady course westward. His officers rotated watches with quiet professionalism. Every few hours, another team took responsibility for navigating the vessel. Lookouts climbed to the crow's nest. Engineers monitored machinery deep below. Stewards attended to passengers. Each department relied upon the others. A great ocean liner functioned rather like a small city. Most people noticed only the pleasant parts. Very few ever saw the complicated systems keeping everything running smoothly. Down in the boiler rooms, however, comfort felt very far away. The temperature was intense. Coal dust settled over clothing and skin. Firemen worked in exhausting shifts, feeding coal into the roaring furnaces. Every shovel helped generate the steam needed to turn the enormous engines. It was relentless work. Without them, Titanic would have drifted nowhere at all. Above their heads, passengers enjoyed afternoon concerts. Below, men sweated beside walls of glowing fire. The contrast could hardly have been greater. One deck held polished silver and fine china. Another held coal, heat, and noise, yet both were equally necessary. The ship's engineering itself remained deeply impressive. Her reciprocating steam engines drove the outer propellers. A massive steam turbine powered the central propeller. Together they produced extraordinary power while maintaining a surprisingly smooth ride. Passengers often commented on how little vibration they felt. Compared with older liners, Titanic seemed almost graceful. Of course, graceful remains a relative term when describing a vessel weighing more than 46,000 tons. She still required an astonishing amount of ocean simply to turn around. The weather remained unusually pleasant. The sea stayed calm. The wind remained light. Bright sunshine reflected across the water during the day, while cool evenings encouraged passengers to gather indoors. Many later remembered these first days as exceptionally peaceful, almost restful. The Atlantic seemed unusually welcoming. That calm weather, however, carried one small disadvantage. Without wind, the surface of the sea became remarkably smooth, beautiful to look at, less helpful for spotting floating ice. But no one considered that especially important. Not yet. Wireless operators Jack Phillips and Harold Bride stayed busy throughout the voyage. Their radio equipment represented one of the marvels of modern technology. Messages arrived from other ships, weather reports, navigation information, private telegrams from passengers, business messages destined for New York. The wireless room rarely remained quiet for long. Imagine how remarkable it must have seemed in 1912 to send words through empty air across hundreds of miles of open ocean. Today, we barely notice messages arriving instantly from the other side of the world. Back then, it felt almost magical. Passengers paid to send greetings home. Having a wonderful voyage. See you soon. Simple messages, small moments. None imagined that many of those telegrams would later become treasured family keepsakes. Elsewhere, the ship's musicians played softly in the lounges. Card games filled quiet afternoons. Books changed hands. Strangers became acquaintances. Acquaintances became dinner companions. A voyage lasting several days naturally encouraged conversation. There was, after all, nowhere else to go. As another evening settled over the Atlantic, the sky slowly darkened. The ship continued westward beneath countless stars. Its lights glowed warmly against the surrounding darkness. From a distance, Titanic must have appeared like a small floating town crossing an endless black sea. Inside, passengers prepared for another peaceful night. The officers checked their instruments. The engineers maintained their machinery. The wireless operators continued receiving messages from ships scattered across the North Atlantic. Some of those messages mentioned ice farther ahead. Routine reports, nothing unusual for April. They were noted, discussed, and passed along through the proper channels. The Atlantic had always contained ice. Ships had navigated around it for decades. No one believed this voyage would be any different. And so, with engines beating steadily beneath the decks and the stars stretching overhead, Titanic pressed onward into the vast Atlantic. The ocean remained calm. The ship remained magnificent. And for everyone aboard, tomorrow looked very much like today, comfortable, orderly, and entirely ordinary. No one yet realized how quickly, by the morning of April 13th, 1912, Titanic had settled comfortably into the rhythm of the Atlantic. If you had wandered through her corridors that day, you probably would have found very little to suggest you were aboard what would later become the world's most famous ship. It simply felt normal. That may be the most surprising part of the story. History often remembers extraordinary moments. The people living through them usually experience long stretches of ordinary life. Breakfast arrived on schedule. Stewards knocked politely on cabin doors. Coffee steamed gently from silver pots. Fresh bread, fruit, porridge, and eggs appeared on tables throughout the ship. In first class, breakfast could be as elaborate or as simple as each passenger preferred. Some enjoyed several courses. Others were perfectly content with toast and tea while reading the morning newspapers that had been brought aboard before departure. Of course, those newspapers contained nothing about icebergs. Instead, they discussed politics, business, sporting events, and society news. The outside world still felt surprisingly close, even though Europe was already hundreds of miles behind them. After breakfast, many passengers headed outside. The April air carried a noticeable chill, but the sunshine made the promenade decks inviting. Deck chairs lined the open spaces. Some passengers wrapped themselves in blankets while reading novels. Others simply watched the endless movement of the sea. There is something strangely hypnotic about an ocean voyage. The horizon barely changes. The waves repeat themselves endlessly. The engines provide a steady, comforting rhythm beneath your feet. Eventually, even people who normally struggle to sit still begin slowing down. Perhaps the ocean quietly persuades everyone to match its pace. In first class, conversations drifted from travel to investments, family news and holiday plans. Many of the passengers belonged to circles where everyone seemed to know someone else. Introductions came easily. "So, where are you staying in New York? Have you traveled with White Star before? What do you think of the ship?" The final question appeared quite often, and the answer was usually the same. People were impressed. The public rooms were spacious, the service attentive, the cabins beautifully furnished. Titanic was living up to her reputation, not by being flashy, but by making luxury feel effortless. Meanwhile, life in second class remained comfortable and pleasantly busy. Families gathered in the library. Children played simple games. Teachers and clergymen exchanged stories. Musicians occasionally entertained small groups. Many later recalled that second-class accommodation exceeded anything they had expected. White Star had invested heavily in making the experience enjoyable across every level of the ship. Third class had its own routines. Meals were served at fixed times. Children explored every corner they were allowed to visit. Parents shared stories about relatives waiting in America. Languages mixed together in dining rooms and passageways. English blended with Swedish, Irish, Finnish, Arabic, and many others. Sometimes, people understood one another perfectly. Sometimes, smiles did most of the work. Hope, it turns out, requires very little translation. Deep below the passenger decks, another day unfolded according to an entirely different timetable. The boiler rooms never truly rested. Firemen worked in exhausting shifts. Each furnace demanded a constant supply of coal. Every few minutes, another shovelful disappeared into the glowing fire. The heat remained relentless, the noise almost overwhelming. Conversation had to compete with the roar of machinery. When one shift ended, another immediately took its place. The engines cared very little about human fatigue. They simply kept turning. It is easy to admire magnificent ships. It is equally important to remember the thousands of hours of unseen labor that kept them moving. Titanic's officers continued their routine observations. Every few hours, they checked the ship's position using celestial navigation. Without satellites or GPS, experienced navigators relied on the sun, stars, and careful mathematics. It demanded patience, precision, and years of practice. Even in an age of impressive engineering, much of navigation still depended upon human skill. Captain Edward Smith spent portions of each day walking the bridge or speaking with passengers. He projected calm confidence. Crew members respected him. Passengers often found reassurance simply seeing him on deck. Experience has a way of creating its own quiet authority. The weather remained remarkably pleasant. The sea continued to lie unusually flat. Some sailors remarked upon the calm conditions. Others simply appreciated the smooth voyage. There had been crossings far rougher than this. Many passengers who feared seasickness considered themselves rather fortunate. Not every Atlantic crossing offered such gentle conditions. As afternoon drifted into evening, Titanic continued westward at a steady pace. She covered hundreds of miles each day. Behind her, the wake stretched far into the distance before gradually disappearing into the endless Atlantic. Ahead, only open water, or so it seemed. Throughout the day, Wireless operators Jack Phillips and Harold Bride remained exceptionally busy. Passengers eagerly sent personal messages to friends and family. Businessmen transmitted instructions to colleagues waiting in New York. The wireless equipment rarely enjoyed a quiet moment. Alongside these private messages came routine communications from other ships, weather observations, navigation updates, reports of sea conditions. Several vessels mentioned floating ice in parts of the North Atlantic. Such reports were neither unusual nor especially alarming. Ice frequently drifted south during the spring months. Captains expected to receive these warnings. They adjusted course or remained watchful as necessary. The information reached TITANIC'S bridge through normal procedures. Nothing about the report suggested immediate danger. After all, ships had crossed these waters for generations. Routine can be wonderfully reassuring. Sometimes, perhaps a little too reassuring. As darkness approached, the temperature began falling. Passengers noticed the cooler air during evening walks. Many chose to spend more time indoors. The ship's lounges became pleasantly busy. Soft conversation filled the rooms. Cards were shuffled. Books remained open on comfortable chairs. The musicians played familiar melodies that drifted gently through the corridors. Elsewhere, stewards quietly prepared cabins for the night. Curtains were drawn. Beds turned down. Fresh water replaced. Everything ready before passengers returned from dinner. It was the sort of careful attention that often goes unnoticed until it is absent. Titanic excelled at making complicated service appear effortless. Dinner itself remained one of the day's highlights. The menus reflected the expectations of the Edwardian upper class. Several courses, carefully prepared dishes, elegant presentation. For many first-class passengers, dinner became as much a social event as a meal. Conversation stretched comfortably between courses. Nobody hurried. Time seemed wonderfully abundant. Far above the dining rooms, stars gradually filled the night sky. Away from the lights of cities, the heavens appeared astonishingly bright. Countless stars reflected faintly upon the calm Atlantic. The sea looked almost like polished black glass, beautiful, quiet, peaceful. Experienced sailors admired such nights. Yet they also knew these conditions demanded extra attention. Without wind, waves no longer broke against floating ice. Normally, those small white lines helped reveal obstacles in darkness. On an exceptionally calm night, that natural warning became much harder to see. Still, aboard Titanic, the evening unfolded with complete normality. Passengers laughed softly over coffee. Children slept soundly in their cabins. Engineers maintained their machinery. Lookouts prepared for another watch in the crow's nest. No one sensed that the voyage was approaching its most significant night, not because they were careless, but because every previous hour had encouraged confidence. The ship was performing beautifully. The weather had been favorable. The crew remained experienced. Everything appeared exactly as it should, and perhaps that is one of history's quietest lessons. Life rarely changes all at once. Most days resemble the day before, until, without much warning, one day does not. As midnight drew nearer and Titanic continued steadily west across the Atlantic, the great liner seemed almost inseparable from the calm sea surrounding her. She moved confidently through the darkness. Her lights glowed warmly against the cold night. Her engines beat with steady certainty. From every appearance, it was simply another peaceful evening aboard a remarkable ship. The Atlantic, however, was preparing to remind everyone that it had always played by its own rules. Sunday, April 14th, 1912, began much like every other day aboard Titanic. The morning arrived with clear skies and a calm, sea. Sunlight spread across the Atlantic in long ribbons of silver, and the great ship continued westward with quiet confidence. If anyone had asked the passengers how the voyage was going, most would probably have answered with a smile. Wonderfully. The ship had proven herself comfortable. The weather had been cooperative. Meals were excellent. The engines performed flawlessly. Even those who had been nervous about spending several days at sea had begun relaxing into the rhythm of life on board. Breakfast came and went. Deck chairs filled once again. Children found new games to invent. Some passengers wrote postcards they planned to mail as soon as they reached New York. Others simply watched the ocean. An endless horizon has an interesting effect on people. Some become reflective. Some become restless. Others discover they are perfectly happy doing almost nothing at all. There are worse ways to spend an afternoon. Throughout the day, Captain Edward Smith received additional wireless reports from other ships. Several vessels operating farther north had encountered drifting ice. Some described large ice fields. Others reported numerous icebergs. These messages were not unusual for April. The North Atlantic shipping lanes frequently crossed regions where ice drifted south from Greenland. Captains expected such reports. They compared them with their own position and continued accordingly. Titanic's officers remained aware that ice existed ahead. The question was not whether ice was present. It almost certainly was. The question was where. The Atlantic is unimaginably vast. An iceberg occupies only a tiny fraction of it. Finding one by accident might seem unlikely. Unfortunately, unlikely does not mean impossible. As afternoon slipped toward evening, the temperature slowly began falling. Passengers noticed the cooler air during walks along the promenade deck. Many reached for heavier coats. Some chose to remain indoors after dinner. Inside, the ship felt warm and inviting. Electric lights glowed softly. Conversations drifted through lounges and dining rooms. The orchestra performed familiar pieces. Tea and coffee were served. Stewards continued moving quietly through the corridors, making sure every passenger remained comfortable. Nothing suggested that this evening would be remembered for generations. The officers on the bridge maintained their normal routine. Courses were checked, positions calculated, lookouts prepared for another night. In the wireless room, Jack Phillips remained exceptionally busy. Passenger telegrams had accumulated after a temporary equipment issue earlier in the voyage, and he was working steadily to clear the backlog. Messages traveled back and forth across the Atlantic. Business correspondence, family greetings, travel updates. Mixed among them came more reports concerning ice. One message from another ship described large icebergs directly along the route. Phillips acknowledged the communication but returned to the growing stack of commercial traffic. His workload was considerable. Wireless communication was still a relatively new technology. Passengers were delighted by the opportunity to send messages across an ocean, and they made full use of it. As darkness settled over the Atlantic, something unusual became increasingly noticeable. The sea remained almost perfectly calm. There was very little wind, hardly any swell. The surface looked smooth enough to reflect the stars overhead. Beautiful, peaceful, almost unreal. Experienced sailors sometimes viewed such conditions with mixed feelings. Calm water made for a comfortable voyage. It also made ice more difficult to detect at night. Normally, waves breaking around the base of an iceberg created white foam that could be seen from a distance. On this exceptionally still night, that helpful outline would be largely absent. Meanwhile, Passengers gradually retired to their cabins. Some lingered over late conversations, others read for a few minutes before extinguishing their lights. Children had long since fallen asleep. Deep below them, the engineers and firemen continued their endless work. The furnaces still demanded coal. The engines still required steam. The heartbeat of the ship never paused. High above the decks, in the crow's nest, two lookouts, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, watched the darkness ahead. Their task required extraordinary concentration. There were no powerful searchlights sweeping across the ocean. Those were not part of standard navigation. Instead, the lookouts relied on their eyesight. The stars overhead provided some light. The sea ahead remained almost black. Every few moments they scanned the horizon again and again and again, hour after hour. Far below, the bridge officers maintained their watch. Titanic continued at roughly the same speed she had carried throughout much of the voyage. Modern discussions often focus on this decision. With the benefit of hindsight, slowing down seems obvious. But hindsight is an unusually confident companion. At the time, many experienced captains continued at normal speed while carefully navigating areas where ice had been reported, particularly when visibility appeared good. The procedures of 1912 were shaped by the experience available in 1912. History teaches lessons, usually after the examination is already finished. By 10 o'clock, the night had grown noticeably colder. Several crew members remarked upon it. The air carried a sharp edge. Some passengers who stepped outside only briefly quickly returned indoors. The warmth of the lounges suddenly seemed much more attractive. The orchestra packed away their instruments for the evening. Stewards completed their final rounds. Lights remained visible from hundreds of cabin windows. One by one, those lights disappeared as passengers drifted to sleep. The Atlantic stretched endlessly in every direction. Above, the stars burned with remarkable clarity. Below, the engines continued their steady rhythm. Everything appeared calm. Everything appeared orderly. Everything appeared exactly as it had for days. Yet somewhere ahead, beyond the reach of the ship's lights, a massive iceberg drifted silently through the cold North Atlantic. It had likely begun its journey years earlier as part of a Greenland glacier. Snow had fallen, compressed into ice, slowly crept toward the sea, broken away, then floated southward, carried by currents that neither knew nor cared about human schedules. It possessed no intention, no purpose. It was simply part of nature. The ship was moving. The iceberg was drifting. Their paths were gradually converging. Neither the passengers sleeping peacefully below decks nor the officers calmly performing their duties could yet see what lay ahead. For the moment, Titanic remained what she had been all week, a magnificent liner crossing a calm ocean beneath a brilliant sky. And the night continued, minute by quiet minute, toward one of the most studied moments in maritime history. The ship continued steadily through the darkness. It was now late on the evening of April 14th, 1912. Most of the passengers were asleep. The public rooms, so lively only a few hours earlier, had grown quiet. Soft electric lights illuminated empty corridors. Stewards finished their last duties before taking a well-earned rest. Only those whose work never truly ended remained busy. Engineers tended the machinery. Firemen continued feeding coal into the furnaces. Officers stood their watches on the bridge. Lookouts scanned the black horizon. The Atlantic seemed almost perfectly peaceful. The stars overhead were brilliant. Without clouds or moonlight, they appeared brighter than many passengers had ever seen. The sea reflected only faint traces of that light. Ahead of the ship stretched an enormous expanse of darkness. It was beautiful. It was calm, and it concealed almost everything. Frederick Fleet stood high in the crow's nest. Beside him was Reginald Lee. Their job was wonderfully simple to describe and remarkably difficult to perform. Watch ahead, notice anything unusual, report it immediately. Hour after hour they searched the horizon. Cold air swept across the platform. The temperature had dropped steadily throughout the evening. Their breath was visible. Hands grew numb despite gloves. Looking into darkness for long periods can be strangely exhausting. Every distant shadow begins to resemble something else. Every slight change in the horizon catches the eye. Most turn out to be nothing. You simply keep looking. Far below, 6th Officer James Moody remained on the bridge with 1st Officer William Murdoch. The routine of navigation continued as it always had. Courses were checked. The compass confirmed the ship remained on track. The engines maintained their steady rhythm. Nothing suggested immediate danger. At around 11:40 p.m., Fleet noticed something different. Not a flash, not a sudden movement. Instead, a darker shape against an already dark horizon. It seemed almost impossible at first. Then it became unmistakable, an object directly ahead. He reached for the warning bell. 3 sharp rings echoed from the crow's nest. The signal every bridge officer recognized instantly. Obstacle ahead. Fleet immediately picked up the telephone connected to the bridge. "Iceberg right ahead." The message was brief. There was no need for extra words. Murdoch reacted almost immediately. Orders were given to alter course. The engines were instructed to reduce power. Every second mattered. Titanic responded. But ships of that size do not turn like small boats. 46,000 tons possess tremendous momentum. Even with experienced officers and responsive steering, changing direction required both time and distance. The bow began to swing. For a moment it appeared the maneuver might succeed. The iceberg slowly moved along the starboard side. Passengers in nearby cabins later recalled hearing almost nothing. Some described a faint vibration. Others remembered a gentle scraping sensation. Several barely woke at all. It was not the dramatic crash often portrayed in films. Instead, it felt surprisingly subtle, almost disappointingly ordinary. Nature does not always announce itself with loud noises. Sometimes it changes history with little more than a long scrape against steel. The iceberg passed alongside the ship and disappeared into the darkness behind. On deck, a few pieces of ice landed near the forward well deck. Some crew members reportedly picked them up with curiosity. To them, it seemed more like an unusual interruption than a catastrophe. Inside the bridge, however, the officers understood that the collision required immediate inspection. The question was simple: how much damage had been done? Below the waterline, the answer was already becoming clear. The iceberg had not torn a single enormous hole through the hull, as many people imagine. Instead, the impact damaged a series of steel plates and seams over a considerable length. Water began entering several forward compartments. At first, it seemed manageable. Ships were designed to handle flooding. That was precisely why Titanic had 16 watertight compartments. The trouble lay not in one compartment, but in several. As engineers began assessing the situation, water continued rising. It flowed into the first compartment, then another, then another. The watertight bulkheads prevented water spreading sideways, but they did not extend all the way to the upper decks. As the bow settled lower into the sea, water gradually spilled over the tops of the bulkheads into the next compartment, like a row of connected cups being filled one after another. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, quickly joined Captain Smith. Together they examined the reports arriving from below. Andrews understood the ship better than almost anyone alive. He knew her dimensions, her strengths, her limitations. He listened carefully. He asked precise questions. Then he performed a rapid mental calculation. The conclusion was devastating. Titanic could remain afloat with 4 forward compartments flooded. Possibly, but not with 5. The reports indicated that more than 5 had been breached. There was no practical solution, no emergency repair, no pump powerful enough to remove water entering that quickly. After only a few minutes of calculation, Andrews quietly informed Captain Smith the ship would not survive. She had perhaps 2 hours, maybe a little more. Imagine receiving that information. One moment you command the newest and grandest liner in the world. The next, you realize she cannot be saved. Captain Smith asked several calm questions. There was little emotion in the conversation, not because nobody cared, because there was work to do. An emergency at sea rewards clear thinking. Panic helps no one. The captain gave the order to prepare the lifeboats. At first, the instructions seemed almost unnecessary. Many passengers had felt virtually nothing. Some remained asleep. Others continued reading in their cabins. The engines had stopped, and that unusual silence attracted more attention than the collision itself. People naturally wondered why the ship had halted. A few looked from their windows. Others stepped into the corridors. Questions spread quietly. Have we arrived somewhere? Is there a mechanical problem? Why have we stopped? Crew members reassured passengers while awaiting further instructions. There was no shouting, no running, no widespread fear. Not yet. The Atlantic remained calm. The stars still shone overhead. The ship remained brightly illuminated. From almost every outward appearance, she looked perfectly safe. Only those studying the flooding below decks understood how quickly circumstances were changing. Within minutes, wireless operators Jack Phillips and Harold Bride received orders to prepare distress calls. Their equipment, so busy earlier with passenger messages, would now serve a very different purpose. Nearby ships needed to know help was required, urgently. For the first time in the voyage, Titanic was no longer simply crossing the Atlantic. She was asking the Atlantic for assistance. And the nearest ships, scattered across hundreds of miles of ocean, began listening,